The Old West is often remembered as a place of bravery. Movies show strong men riding horses across golden land. They show sheriffs wearing shiny badges. They show gunfights that end with justice. They show order rising from chaos. But the real Old West was not that simple. It was a time of fear. It was a time of hunger. It was a time when two different worlds were forced to live on the same land. And when two worlds collide, someone always suffers. This is not a story about famous outlaws or legendary gunfighters. It is not a story about gold or glory. It is a story about something much quieter and much darker. It is the story of a Comanche woman. Her name was never written in official reports. Her voice was never recorded in history books. But what happened to her reflects a larger truth about the American frontier. A truth that many people preferred not to remember. To understand what happened, we must first understand the world she lived in. Long before Texas became part of the United States, long before railroads cut through the plains, the Comanche ruled vast lands across what is now Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. They were powerful horse riders. In fact, many historians believe they were among the best horse warriors in history. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Horses were not just animals. They were life. They were speed, protection, and wealth. The Comanche followed the buffalo across wide grasslands. They moved with the seasons. They lived in tipis that could be packed and carried quickly. They were not poor people living in empty land. They had a system. They had leaders te ad lawus. They had families. To them, the plains were home. But in the early 1800s, change began moving west. Settlers arrived in Texas, looking for land. Some came from the United States. Others came from Europe. They built small farms and wooden homes. They planted crops. They raised cattle. At first, the land seemed endless. But land is never truly empty. The settlers saw opportunity. The Comanche saw invasion. As more families arrived, tension grew. Fences were built across open plains where buffalo once ran free. Hunting areas were reduced. Water sources became controlled. The Comanche responded the only way they knew how, through raids. They took horses from settlements. They attacked small farms. They tried to push settlers away from their territory. To settlers, these raids felt like terror. To the Comanche, they were defense. Fear grew on both sides. In response, local militias were formed. Eventually, the Texas Rangers became one of the main forces protecting frontier communities. At first, they were not a large organized army. They were groups of volunteers, riders who knew the land and could track enemies over long distances. Over time, their reputation grew. They were known for being tough. They were known for being relentless. They were known for not giving up. But the frontier was not a place of clear rules. There were no cameras. There were no reporters following patrols. There were no courts nearby to question actions taken in the field. When rangers rode into native territory, what happened often depended on anger, fear, and the mood of the moment. Violence became common. Villages were burned. Horses were taken. People were killed. And sometimes, people were captured. It was during one of these ranger expeditions into Comanche territory that the woman in our story was taken. The patrol had been tracking a group of Comanche warriors, believed to be responsible for raids on nearby settlements. The rangers had lost friends in those attacks. Some had lost family members. Anger was heavy in their hearts. They found a Comanche camp near dawn. Surprise was a common tactic in frontier warfare. Attacking at sunrise meant confusion. Warriors might not be ready. Families would still be asleep. The rangers moved in quickly. Gunshots broke the silence of morning. Horses screamed. Children cried. Smoke rose as tipis caught fire. Comanche men fought back. They always did. But surprise and firearms gave the rangers an advantage. When the fighting ended, several warriors were dead. Some had escaped. The camp was destroyed, and among the survivors was a woman. She was not armed. She had been trying to gather children and move them away from danger. Witness accounts from later retellings say she stood with quiet strength, even as she was surrounded. She was captured alive. Why was she not killed, like others? Some say she was taken for questioning. Rangers often wanted information about the location of other camps or leaders. Others believed something else played a role. On the frontier, revenge was powerful. When settlers were attacked, stories spread quickly about women and children harmed in raids. Whether every story was fully true did not always matter. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into hatred, and hatred often seeks a target. The Comanche woman became that target. She was tied and placed on horseback. The Rangers began the long ride back toward their settlement. The journey was hard. Texas land is rough and wide. Days were hot. Nights were cold. The woman was given little comfort. She walked when horses were tired. She was watched constantly. Some Rangers saw her as a prisoner of war. Others saw her as something less. During the ride, there were arguments among the men. A few believed she should be handed over to military authorities for exchange or questioning. Others believed she deserved punishment for raids committed by her people, but she herself had not been proven guilty of any attack. That did not matter to some. When they reached the settlement, news spread quickly that a Comanche woman had been captured. Settlers gathered to see her. Many had lived in fear of raids for years. Some had buried loved ones. Pain does not always lead to mercy. She was held in a wooden structure near the edge of town. Guards were posted. People came to look at her, as if she were proof of victory. 4 days, she was questioned. They asked about other camps. They asked about leaders. They asked about future raids. She did not speak English well. Communication was limited. Frustration grew. What happened next was not fully recorded in official ranger reports. That silence is important. Private letters written by settlers at the time mention harsh treatment. They describe anger boiling over. They speak of punishment meant to send a message. Frontier justice was often quick and brutal. There were few formal trials for native captives. Decisions were made by men who were both judge and executioner. The Comanche woman was publicly humiliated. She was displayed as a symbol of victory. Some accounts suggest she was physically abused. Others describe her being forced to walk through town as people shouted insults. Whether every detail can be proven or not, one fact remains clear. She was not treated as a human being with dignity. She was treated as an object of revenge. In the following days, her condition weakened. Whether from injury, mistreatment, or illness, she grew ill. There are no official execution records. There is no proper burial record with her name, but local memory passed down a quiet truth. She did not survive long after her capture. And then, the story faded. Official ranger reports focused on the successful raid against a hostile camp. They listed supplies taken and enemies killed. They praised bravery. The woman was barely mentioned. Why? Because her suffering did not fit the heroic image forming around the Rangers. In later years, the Texas Rangers became symbols of state pride. Books celebrated their courage. Stories were told of lawmen bringing order to wild lands. Few wanted to talk about moments when anger replaced justice, and so her story was pushed aside. But history has a way of resurfacing. Modern historians began reading old letters. They began speaking with native communities. They began asking harder questions about frontier violence. Patterns began to appear. This was not an isolated event. Throughout Westward expansion, native women were captured, abused, or humiliated during conflicts. Settler women also suffered during raids. The frontier was brutal for everyone, but power was shifting. The Rangers represented a growing government. They had support, weapons, and official backing. The Comanche were slowly being pushed into smaller territories. When one side grows stronger, the balance changes. The Comanche woman who died in that settlement became part of a larger story. The story of a people losing land, power, and safety. For the Comanche, these were not small events. They were wounds. Every woman taken was a daughter, a sister, a mother. Every humiliation was a message, and messages written in pain echo across generations. As buffalo numbers fell and settlers continued arriving, the Comanche faced increasing pressure. Battles continued for years. Eventually, many were forced onto reservations. Their world changed forever. But among their oral traditions, stories of cruelty were remembered. Stories of women taken and mistreated were told quietly from one generation to another. Even when official history remained silent, memory survived. The Comanche woman in this story represents those silent memories. Her name may be lost, but her experience reflects something real about the Old West. It was not only a story of brave leman, it was also a story of fear turning into cruelty. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that get buried deepest. This is only the beginning. Her story does not end with her death, because what was done to her became part of something larger, a pattern that shaped the relationship between native tribes and frontier authorities for decades. The death of the Comanche woman did not create peace. It did not stop raids. It did not end fear. It did not bring justice to anyone who had suffered before her. Instead, it deepened something already growing on the frontier: bitterness. When violence happens once, it shocks people. When violence happens again and again, it changes people. After her capture and death, news traveled in different ways. Among settlers, the story was told as proof that the Rangers were strong. Some spoke proudly about striking back against the Comanche. They believed harsh action would stop future attacks. They believed fear was necessary. But among the Comanche, the story traveled differently. Survivors of the destroyed camp carried the memory back to their people. They spoke of a dawn attack. They spoke of warriors killed. They spoke of a woman taken and never returned. In Comanche culture, women were not weak figures. They worked hard. They supported the camp. They carried knowledge and tradition. The loss of one woman meant the loss of part of the community's future. Her capture was not just a personal tragedy. It was an insult. And insults in times of war rarely go unanswered. Raids continued in the following months. Some historians believe that attacks became more intense in certain areas. It is impossible to say whether her death directly caused any specific retaliation. But in frontier life, memory fueled action. Each side kept a mental list of wrongs. Each side remembered its dead. The Rangers continued their patrols. They tracked groups across rivers and plains. They followed horse prints for miles under the hot sun. Their job was simple in description, but brutal in reality. Find and stop those seen as enemies. But stopping enemies often meant destroying villages, killing warriors, and capturing whoever remained. The lines between defense and aggression became thinner. For the Rangers, there was growing political pressure as well. Settlements were expanding fast. Land was valuable. Leaders wanted stability. Stability meant pushing native tribes farther away from growing towns. This was not just personal revenge anymore. It was policy. The United States was moving west. The idea of expansion was strong. Many believed it was their destiny to spread across the continent. In that belief, native tribes were obstacles. When a group is seen as an obstacle instead of as human beings, cruelty becomes easier to justify. The Comanche were once powerful enough to resist strongly, but by the mid to late 1800s, the situation was changing. Buffalo herds were shrinking quickly because of commercial hunting. Without buffalo, the Comanche economy suffered. Food became harder to find. Starvation is a powerful enemy. At the same time, the Rangers were becoming more organized. They had better weapons. They had stronger political support. They had clear orders to weaken native resistance. It was in this larger environment that the story of the Comanche woman faded into the background. Official records rarely focused on individuals unless they were famous leaders. Instead, reports talked about numbers. How many enemies killed? How many horses captured? How many supplies destroyed? Numbers are easier than names. Numbers do not ask questions, but somewhere in Comanche memory, she remained more than a number. She became a symbol of humiliation, and humiliation does something dangerous. It stays alive even when time passes. In many frontier towns, settlers told stories about savage attacks. Children grew up hearing frightening tales of native warriors riding in at night. Fear shaped their view of the world. At the same time, native children grew up hearing about burned camps and relatives killed by Rangers. They learned that settlers could not be trusted. Fear on both sides became part of identity. The Comanche woman's story existed inside this cycle. She was not famous. She was not a warrior. She was not a leader. She was a civilian caught between powerful forces. Her suffering shows something important about frontier conflict. It was rarely clean or fair. It touched people who never chose to fight. As years passed, more battles took place. Some were large, involving dozens of fighters. Others were small surprise attacks. Gradually, the balance of power shifted even more. The U.S. Army increased its presence. Railroads moved deeper into the plains. Supplies and soldiers could travel faster. Native tribes found it harder to move freely. By the 1870s, major resistance by the Comanche was nearing its end. Many were forced onto reservations in what is now Oklahoma. Life on reservations was very different. The freedom of the plains was gone. The buffalo were nearly gone. Government agents controlled food supplies. Traditional life became difficult to continue. For elders who remembered the wide-open lands, it felt like the world had closed. In this new reality, memories of past violence remained strong. Stories of captured women, destroyed camps, and broken promises were told in quieter ways. Meanwhile, in Texas towns, the legend of the Rangers grew larger. Books were written praising their courage. Newspapers described their bravery in dramatic language. They became symbols of frontier strength. When stories do not match the image a society wants to create, those stories are often pushed aside. The Comanche woman's suffering did not fit the heroic picture, so it stayed hidden. But history does not stay frozen. In the 20th century, historians began re-examining the American frontier. Instead of only reading official reports, they looked at letters, diaries, and native oral traditions. They began asking different questions. They asked whether some ranger actions crossed moral lines. They asked how native communities experienced westward expansion. They asked whose voices were missing. When you look at history from only one side, you see a straight line of progress. When you look from both sides, you see conflict, pain, and complexity. The story of this Comanche woman sits in that complexity. It forces uncomfortable questions. Was she guilty of any crime? Did she deserve punishment? Was justice ever considered? Or was she simply a target for anger? Frontier justice often moved faster than fairness. Men who had seen friends killed might not stop to think about innocence. They saw the enemy as one group, not as individuals. This way of thinking is dangerous. It removes humanity. When humanity is removed, almost anything becomes possible. Some defenders of the Rangers argue that the frontier was brutal on all sides. That is true. Settler families were also attacked. Women and children were sometimes killed or captured in raids. Pain existed everywhere, but recognizing one side's suffering does not erase the others. Two wrongs do not balance each other. What happened to this Comanche woman was part of a wider pattern where civilians became tools in a war over land and power. As decades passed, the United States grew stronger. Texas became more stable. Towns became cities. The frontier slowly disappeared. The Texas Rangers continued as a law enforcement agency. Their modern role is very different from the chaotic days of early patrols. Today, they operate under laws and public oversight. But the past remains part of their legacy. In recent years, some historians and communities have called for honest discussions about Ranger actions during the 19th century. Not to erase history, not to create hate, but to understand it fully, because without full understanding, healing is difficult. The Comanche people still exist today. They maintain their culture and identity. They remember their ancestors. They remember the plains. They remember the loss. For them, the Old West is not a romantic story. It is family history. The unnamed woman in this story may never receive a marker with her name. She may never appear in a textbook paragraph, but her experience represents something larger. The costs paid by ordinary people when powerful forces fight over land and control. History often celebrates winners, but true understanding requires listening to those who lost. Her story also teaches another lesson. Legends are simple. Reality is complicated. It is easy to cheer for heroes in old stories. It is harder to accept that those heroes were human, capable of anger and cruelty. But accepting that truth does not destroy history. It makes it honest, and honesty does not weaken a nation. It strengthens it. The Old West shaped American identity in powerful ways. Ideas of independence, toughness, and bravery grew from that time. But alongside those qualities were fear, revenge, and injustice. Both are part of the story. The Comanche woman's life ended in violence, but her story continues as a reminder that power must be controlled by law, a reminder that anger can lead to cruelty, a reminder that when history is written by only one side, important voices disappear, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder that even in times of war, dignity matters. In Part 3, we will explore how frontier myths were built in books and movies, how the image of the ranger became larger than life, and why stories like hers were kept out of classrooms for generations. Her story is not just about the past.